go ahead in the chat and say it in the chat, so that way we're not interrupting with our voices. All right. So, the attack on Pearl Harbor, that was, the Japanese attack on the American fleet, and it crippled the American fleet, but it also brought the United States into World War II. So, what it essentially did was the Japanese took the American battleships out of the fight really early into the war, and the Americans had to start to rely on their aircraft carriers to fight the rest of the war, and that actually ended up being a good thing that worked out to the United States' advantage. But it wasn't always that way, and we're going to talk about that through this little class, okay? So, the Allied response to Pearl Harbor. So let's talk about what happened. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt declared war on December 8th, 1941. So that's a day after Pearl Harbor, right? And he gave his really famous speech, yesterday, December 7th, 1941. The United States was attacked by the Imperial, Army and Air Forces, Naval and Air Forces of the Empire of Japan, right? So like that really famous speech that he opened World War II with. So America formally enters a war on December 8th, 1941. But at the same time as they were attacking Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces attacked Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong at the same time. So Malaya, Singapore, and Hong Kong were not American installations, but these are British colonies at the time, right? So these are colonies that have a lot of British presence there. So a lot of like Royal Navy, Army, and Air Force installations. We're all just kind of hanging out there. All right. The United States declares war on Japan within hours. So the United States didn't wait an entire day like we did. The United Kingdom. The UK did not wait an entire day like the United States did. The UK actually declared war on Japan like right away, basically. So the UK declared war on Japan. And 3 days later, on December 11th, 1941, Germany and Italy, the other two major Axis powers, also declare war on the United States. So December 11th, 1941 kind of cements the powers all together, because prior to America entering the war, the Allied powers are basically just United Kingdom, China, and France, and I guess Russia, at that point. And the French, were defeated, so it was basically just the UK and Russia and China. So the Americans hadn't actually been brought in yet. All right. So the state of the Pacific, in January of 1942. So a month after Pearl Harbor, now stuff is actually in full swing. The HMS Repulse and the HMS Prince of Wales. So these are the two, major British battleships that were their main capital ships in the Pacific, right? So the Repulse and the Prince of Wales were sunk by Japanese bombers off the coast of Malaya. Now, the Pacific Fleet, all the American battleships, the Arizona, the Nevada, the Oklahoma, the West Virginia, all those battleships were not actually in any shape to create a battle group. A battle group is a group of warships, right? So you'll have capital ships like battleships and cruisers supported by escort ships like destroyers and frigates, right? So you have an entire battle group of ships, and ships typically don't operate by themselves, right? So when you have ships, when you have a navy, you typically will be operating ships in battle groups, because if you send one ship out by itself, it's going to get swarmed by submarines and destroyers and sunk, right? So in order for a fleet to set out, you want to have an entire battle group. So because of the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States didn't have any battleships to form any of these said battle groups, okay? Now, there's 4 United States Navy carriers at the time. There's 3 of them in the Pacific. There's the Lexington, the Enterprise, and the Saratoga. The Yorktown, the Wasp, and the USS Hornet are actually in the Atlantic at the time. So by 1942, the Wasp and the Hornet, have been completed. So we actually had a total of 6 carriers in the entire Navy, which isn't a lot. And the Yorktown was actually rushed to the Pacific Theater after Pearl Harbor. So on December 30th, 1941, it got to San Diego. And it had to actually get there from the Atlantic Ocean. So it steamed really fast, went through the Panama Canal, and became the flagship of Task Force 17 in 1941. So that's now, thanks to this, there's 4 carriers in the Pacific, okay? Now, the entire Japanese Navy obviously has a lot of carriers, so the United States is pretty much outnumbered at this point. Excuse me. Let's see, let's read the chat real quick. Yeah, so initially Russia was not actually an Axis power. The Russians actually never signed a treaty of alliance with Italy or Japan. The Russians had a non-aggression act with Germany when they were invading Poland, but that doesn't mean that the Russians were actually like an Axis power. All right, let's see. All right, so we're going to do something called soapstone. And when we soapstone, it's a process that we do in high school AP classes. Okay, so in AP history classes, when we're looking at documents, when you're looking at, you know, it could be like a cartoon, a photograph, like any sort of historical document, you want to soapstone it, right? So soapstone is an acronym. The first S stands for speaker, and then occasion, exactly. The time and place, context that prompted this document, and then you have the audience. Yeah, so Chris is on top of things. Chris knows what's up. Or Kevin, who's this document meant for? Who's the intended audience, right? The purpose. Why was the document written? For what reason did the creator make this document? Subject. What's the subject of this, right? And then lastly, you have tone. So are you guys all familiar with this? Have you guys done this in other classes before? Awesome. So you guys already know what's up. Okay. Well, it's okay. This might be your first soapstone. So for, I guess, Kevin, it's not, but for most of you guys, it is. All right, so we're gonna do this one. This one's actually really fun. Okay, I'm gonna ask for a volunteer to read this. Anybody want to? Let's see. Izu, can I have you unmute and can you read this, please?
Yep, I will. In all the war, I never received a more direct shock. As I turned and twisted in bed, the full horror of the news sank upon me. There were no British or American capital ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific except the American survivors of Pearl Harbor, who were hastening back to California. Over this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you, Izu. Everyone say good job to Izu in the chat. So, I'm gonna start. So this was spoken by Winston Churchill. He wrote this for the Churchill War Papers in 1941. All right. So what Churchill was talking about was after the Japanese sank the Prince of Wales and repulse, the British didn't have any capital ships in the Pacific. Those were their only two battleships in the entire Pacific Ocean. And all the American battleships were all either damaged or sunk at Pearl Harbor, and the ones that could sail were going back to California to be repaired. All right, so Churchill, yeah, he was the British Prime Minister of United Kingdom during World War II. So this was a big deal because in the entire expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the biggest ocean in the world, Japan had all the power. There were no American or British capital ships in the entire ocean. So that's what he meant by over this vast expanse of waters, Japan was supreme, and we everywhere were weak and naked. Okay, so let's start with S. Who's the speaker? Who's the speaker of this document? I'm going to go ahead and see if anyone wants to tell us who the speaker is. Winston Churchill, says Alina. Can everyone raise? Can you guys all turn on your cameras so I can see your beautiful faces? Oh, I can see like if you're raising your hand or anything like that. See, most of you guys have your cameras on, but I just want to make sure the rest of you guys can do that. Thank you. Winston Churchill. Yeah, so Winston Churchill was the speaker. I kind of gave that one to you guys as a freebie. And what's the occasion? Why did Winston Churchill say this? What made him say this? Anyone care to share? Chinchilla. Kevin says World War II. That's a very general answer, Kevin. Let's see if we can narrow it down from that. What made Winston Churchill say this? What made Winston Churchill? Someone's raising their hand. That is Brian. Brian, go ahead and tell me.
So I think that it is after like Pearl Harbor. I mean, like the British didn't have a lot of shipping there, and also the Americans, most of them were already sunk, and the few ones who had survived are also damaged and are being rushed back to California to be repaired. So that's why he was thinking that there was no way the American small fleet could defeat the Japan.
Yes, because there weren't any more Allied ships left to fight the Japanese Navy, right? So that's the occasion. So like Chris was saying in the chat, yeah, the Japanese Navy was reigned supreme over the Pacific, and the United States and the British were basically defenseless. So that's the occasion. Audience. Who has an idea of who the audience was? Who do you guys think this was written for?
The world, so that scientists and kids and people who like history.
Let's see. Yizu is saying the world. Kevin says the public arena, the people who read the Churchill War Papers. Kevin says us, Allied nation citizens. Yeah, like all these are pretty good answers, right? So, yeah, so the Churchill War Papers were just basically like, you can kind of think of it as like his diary, as Winston Churchill's diary. Japan's a big cheese. Thank you, Kevin. Yeah, it's pretty crazy because like that was kind of like his way of telling everybody like how he felt at that moment, right? So it was kind of a big deal. His audience, was that, or he was trying to tell his audience, actually that leads us right into P, the purpose. What do you think the purpose of this writing was? So P, S, and Tone are going to actually like roll all together in this one. So I see that your hand is up, Brian. I'm going to have you wait for a little bit. I'm going to try to give someone else a chance. You too, Izu. I'm going to let someone else answer this one. I'm going to call on Ava. Hey, Ava. So what do you think? So what do you think the purpose of this writing was? Like, why did Winston Churchill say this? Ava, can you hear me? All right, I'm not sure if Ava can hear me. I'm gonna go to Madison. Madison. Yeah. So why do you think? Hang on. Madison, why do you think Churchill said this?
Because just to inform people.
Yeah, so yeah, so Churchill was trying to tell the people, of the actual situation, right? Of the actual like situation that was going on in the Pacific. Madison, do you think that that Churchill was in a good position or in a bad position?
Bad one, because like he wrote all of this stuff. And they said they were all weak and naked, so like they're probably weak.
Yeah, so they're probably weak. Like he felt weak, he felt powerless, right? The Japanese had all the power in the oceans. So like he felt like he was in a really bad position that he couldn't fight the war. So very good. Yuzo, do you want to add something?
I want to say that nobody was in a good position.
Yuzo thinks that nobody was in a good position.
And if you say Japan, they were bombed after.
Yeah,
So
but
they're not in a
they
good.
weren't bombed then. You know, Japan was in a pretty good position in January of 1942. That much is pretty.
Yeah, by the end
Well,
of
they still all of them was face a bad position, like being bombed.
Yeah, but they weren't getting bombed in 1942. They weren't getting bombed until like 1945. You know, like we had to capture the islands that we were bombing them from. So at this point of the war, Japan was in a really good spot. All right, last one, or so that kind of covers the subject, right? So the United States also and the Great Britain being pretty powerless, and the tone. What do you guys think the tone of this writing is? Chris, what do you think the tone is, Chris?
I don't really know.
You know,
What I'm thinking is it's like a bit informative.
informative. Extrapolate. Like, give me more details.
I think the tone is like, I'm not really sure.
The tone. All right, somebody help him
Well,
out
I
here.
want to say
Izu says traumatized. Who else?
it's also kind of like dramatic and sad.
Dramatic? I think dramatic is like defeated, given up. Yeah, he didn't feel like he was in a really good situation, huh? Helpless, tired. Yeah, all very good answers. The tone is down. Yeah, so so the British were not. Winston Churchill himself was not feeling really good about the state of the Pacific theater at this point because Japan had all their capital ships. The United States had nothing. Great Britain had nothing, and now they were expected to fight an entire war against them. You know, and the Pacific it kind of stretches from the entire American Western seaboard to China, right? So that whole expanse of ocean felt already lost. So this is not a good situation. However, you know, the Allies still had to do what they could do in their power to make things work. All right. So before we go further into describing some key events that are going to happen, I'm going to go ahead and introduce some of the major players of the Pacific War. So the Pacific War, the Japanese figured this out. So when they bombed Pearl Harbor, the Japanese were figuring, okay, we're not going to use battleships to attack Pearl Harbor. We're going to actually use airplanes, large aircraft carriers, to bomb the harbor, right? So carrier aircraft actually played a huge role in the Pacific War because most of the fighting was done with aircraft carriers. The Japanese started the war revolving their battle strategy around aircraft carriers, all right? On the other hand, the United States started the war with no battleships because they all got damaged at Pearl Harbor, right? So the United States had to use their aircraft carriers as their main strike force corps, right? As a core of their strike forces. So, which kind of worked out in the end because it made it like carriers were actually a better idea than battleships, but the United States wasn't completely aware of that at the time. Now, when you have carriers fighting carriers, the main weapons of these aircraft carriers become the aircraft, the air wings of these carriers, right? Like on a battleship, your main weapon is the big cannons on the battleship, but on an aircraft carrier, your main weapons become your aircraft. So let's take a look at the different types of aircraft on a carrier, on a Japanese carrier. So on every carrier, you have three main types of airplanes. You have your fighters, you have your dive bombers, and you have your torpedo bombers. So your fighters are planes that are used to fight other airplanes. Dive bombers are bombers that dive down, so they're bombing targets with more accuracy, with more precision. And torpedo bombers are typically bombers that are used to carry torpedoes to launch torpedoes at other ships. Torpedo bombers also tend to be bigger than dive bombers, so they can carry bigger and also more bombs than a dive bomber can. A torpedo bomber, though, is when it drops bombs, it's flying in a level straight line. So instead of diving down on a target, a torpedo bomber will fly in a straight line and drop a torpedo or drop bombs from high altitude. Okay, so I know that's a lot of information, but if you guys have any questions, you can bear with me or ask them in the chat, and because I'm still reading the chat. Okay, so the very first one on the left, that's a fighter. That's the main Japanese carrier-based fighter of World War II. That's called the Mitsubishi A6M0, right? That was actually the first, it's one of the first fighter planes ever made. That being a carrier-based airplane, it was better than all the land-based airplanes at the time. So at the time of the A6M's introduction, the time of the Zero's introduction of the war, it was actually the best fighter plane in the world, which is kind of a big deal. On the right of the Zero, you have a dive bomber. That's an IG Type 99. The Allies called it the Val. Okay, so it's a dive bomber. It's got, you can see its wheels on the bottom. Those wheels actually don't fold up into the airplane, so they kind of just stick and hang out. So the Val is not a fast airplane. It's pretty slow because those wheels are really draggy. Lastly, we have a torpedo bomber. So that's the Nakajima B5N Kate. Okay, so the Kate is a torpedo bomber, but it can also be used to drop regular bombs, like you see in this picture. If you look in the Kate, you can actually see that the Kate has a crew of 3 people. There is the pilot, there's the gunner in the back, and there's also a navigator in the middle. All right, so the Kate has a crew. The torpedo bomber has a crew of 3 people. The dive bomber has a crew of 2 people, the pilot and the gunner. And the fighter only seats 1 person. So these are the 3 major carrier-based aircraft. It's the same 3 airplanes that were used to bomb Pearl Harbor. The gunner, Chris, operates a little machine gun that kind of sticks out in the back of the airplane, and they use that to protect themselves against planes that are coming in behind them. Okay, because they're slower and more vulnerable than fighter planes, and fighter planes will tend to want to shoot down the bombers. American carrier aircraft. So this is an American torpedo bomber called a Grumman Avenger. So this big airplane carries a torpedo internally. All right. It has a crew of 3. It's got a pilot, a navigator, and a gunner. And the navigator can crawl into a little gun on the bottom of the airplane in the back, and can kind of see it in this picture. And that's, the main American carrier-based aircraft, or carrier-based torpedo bomber for most of World War II. This is an SBD Dauntless. So it's a dive bomber. So that's what the most of the American dive bombers during World War II were used. Or sorry, so that was the most commonly used American dive bomber of World War II. Chris asks, is the cockpit open all the time on the SBD? No. They can actually close the canopy so everyone can be a little bit more enclosed. But a lot of the times they flew with the canopies open for better visibility. And also you can't use the tail guns in the back unless your canopy's open. So that's a big reason why you see them flying around with their cockpits open, the SBDs. This over here is a Grumman F4F Wildcat. So this is the main American carrier-based fighter. It was not as maneuverable as the Zero, and it didn't have as good armament as the Zero. It was also slower. But even though it was not as good as the Zero, it could take a lot of damage. So that was, I guess, an advantage that the Wildcat had. Lastly, we have another kind of dive bomber. So the Americans had an old dive bomber and a new dive bomber. The Avenger that I showed you guys first, that's the new dive bomber. Or sorry, they had a new torpedo bomber and an old torpedo bomber. So the Avenger is the new torpedo bomber. The one in the black and white picture, I chose it to be black and white so you guys could tell that it's older. The Devastator is the old torpedo bomber. Okay, so the Devastator was not as good as the Avenger. It was actually pretty useless. Let's be real. It was pretty obsolete by the time World War II came around. So that's our.
So basically, America had the worst supplies.
America had, we weren't as well equipped, or we weren't as experienced as Japanese, but we're doing our best. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, okay? So that's
Jordan,
what's up?
What about the speed demons, also known as the PT boats?
Yeah, so the PT boats weren't used a lot at this point of the war. The PT boats were used more in later campaigns in the Marshall Islands, and also in like in 43, 44.
Oh, okay.
At this point in the war, we didn't really see PT boats yet.
Okay. Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now, we're talking a little bit about American land-based aircraft too. Okay, so because the Battle of Midway was a battle over Midway Atoll. It was like an island group, and there was an American base at Midway that had airplanes of their own. So this was the big American 4-engine B-17 Flying Fortress. All right, so this was a major airplane that was used by the American Army Air Forces. Here we have a American B-26 Marauder. It's a medium bomber, also flown by the Army Air Forces. And this right here is a Brewster Buffalo. So this plane is called a Buffalo. It's a fighter plane. And the Buffalo was actually flown by U.S. Marines, by the Marine pilots at Midway Island. So these were the 3 American land-based aircraft. So these planes took off from the land bases instead of taking off from aircraft carriers. Now, the first American offensives during World War II were actually pretty early in 1942. Yorktown, the USS Yorktown and the USS Enterprise set sail for the Samoan Islands on January 6th. And on January 25th, they headed over to the Marshall and Gilbert's Islands to hit some Japanese forces over there. So, the very first, major American carrier attack in World War II happened in February 1st, 1942. So the Yorktown Enterprise launched 133 torpedo bombers and dive bombers, and they were hitting Japanese bases in Jaluit, Mili, and the Makin Islands. They sunk 3 Japanese ships, damaged 8 Japanese ships, and they destroyed numerous aircraft and bunkers and other kinds of ground installations and buildings and stuff. So this was a pretty major offensive on the side of the Americans. So this is that's the Yorktown. All right. So on March 1940, on March 6th, 1942, the Lexington and the Yorktown met up and started to patrol the Coral Sea to attack Japanese shipping in Rabaul. So Rabaul is an island that the Japanese use as their major base. And on March 10th, 104 U.S. carrier planes from the Lexington and the Yorktown attacked Japanese bases and ships at Lae, and they only lost 1 airplane. So 103 of these 104 carrier aircraft made it home. Now, so that kind of sets the stage for the Battle of the Coral Sea, right? And why is this important? We weren't sinking Japanese ships or anything like that, but why do you think that I would bring up these early American offenses? Why do you guys think that, I'm talking about these offenses instead of going right into the actual battle? What's important about these? About these little small operations that the United States Navy is waging against Japanese forces? Jerry, what do you think?
I think they kind of chipped away at the Japanese army and made them weaker little by little. And
Jerry
then eventually at the big war, they had a little.
Jerry thinks that we're trying to chip away at the Japanese forces instead of fighting them head on. If we can start to attack, take little bites out of the Japanese war machine. That's a good take. Let's see, who else?
Maybe they're trying to try to weaken their army so they have a better chance, because if they right now attack, they will probably lose instantly.
So Alex says that waiting for the right moment to strike the Japanese. That's also another point. Kevin says to show how strong we are. Yeah. Do you guys think that we're taking these little small actions, these little smaller operations? Would you believe me if I said that we did this also to just give our pilots experience? Because our pilots had never seen combat before, right? Mm-hmm. Our carrier pilots had never actually gone to war. And by taking these, smaller missions to go out and just hit some Japanese bases, in the middle of the, in the islands and stuff, even though we weren't doing a lot of damage, we were still having our pilots get the experience of taking off from a ship, bombing something, coming home, right? And this is a valuable experience because that is going to be how the how the American pilots get the, flight hours, learn how to fly their planes, learn how to, use their aircraft in combat, so, because they know that they're fighting against the most experienced naval aviators in the world, right? In 1942, no country was better at using carriers than Japan. So America is not only the weakest and most inexperienced, carrier forces in the Pacific, they're also fighting against the most experienced carrier force in the Pacific. So it's pretty crazy. Chris is asking, don't they have like practice battles? Yeah. So the Americans had combat exercises, but they didn't actually see real combat until now. And it's important to make a distinction because the actual real life war is a lot different than like a combat exercise. So at the Battle of Coral Sea, the Japanese had 2 carriers, the Zuikaku and the Shokaku. They had 1 light cruiser, 9 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 139 carrier aircraft. So the Shokaku and the Zuikaku were slightly smaller than most like fleet carriers. They were actually the 2 smaller carriers out of the larger Japanese strike group, which is called the Kita Butai. And these 2 carriers, so that's like each of them only carried about each of them carried only about 70 aircraft each. So surface ships are like tankers, seaplane tenders, just like smaller vessels that were there to support the fleet, right? So they're not like battleships, or like they weren't like big warships, but they're just kind of support ships. That's what a surface, like assorted surface ships, kind of refers to. The American forces at the Battle of Coral Sea consist of the Yorktown and the Lexington. Also, the Americans have 8 cruisers, 14 destroyers, and 129 carrier aircraft. So going by these numbers, the Battle of Coral Sea is actually pretty even. Okay, so the Americans successfully were able to get into a fight where we're only fighting 2 out of their carriers instead of all 6 of them. If we had 2 carriers versus 6 carriers, this would not have ended well. So we got pretty lucky at Coral Sea to only be engaging 2 of the Imperial Japanese Navy's carriers, right, instead of all 6. Battle of the Coral Sea is also important because it's the first naval engagement between fleets of ships that never see each other. All right. It's entirely waged over carrier forces, something that's called over the horizon. So the Battle of Coral Sea is waged over the horizon of the ocean, so between like where one ship never sees the other ship, as opposed to before this, during battleship duels or things like that, you would actually have 2 ships that were actually seeing each other in combat. But the Battle of the Coral Sea was the first naval battle ever that a ship launched airplanes to attack another ship, which launched airplanes to attack them, and the 2 ships themselves never actually see each other through their periscopes or through their scopes and binoculars. So at the end of the war, at the end of this battle, the USS Lexington was actually sunk. So the United States, as a result, lost 25% of its carriers in the Pacific because we only had 4 carriers, remember? So we only had 4 carriers in the entire Pacific at this point in the war. And the United States lost 1 of them already, so now you're down to 75% of your carrier fleet. However, planes from the Yorktown and the Lexington sunk the Shokaku, and the Shokaku was gone, so strike 1 for the Japanese, and they actually shot down enough airplanes from the Zuikaku that the Zuikaku had to return to Japan to train new pilots and to get more airplanes. Okay, because that's important with a carrier. If your carrier is out of airplanes, it's not very useful in the battle anymore, is it? So they sunk the Shokaku, and they didn't sink the Zuikaku, but they shot down enough of airplanes from the Zuikaku that they effectively took 2 carriers out of the battle. Chris is asking how much damage did the USS Yorktown receive? The USS Yorktown was actually pretty damaged. It was, I would say, like if you want to say like on a scale of like 1 to 100, like what percent damage the Yorktown received, it was actually close to 50%. The Yorktown was limping back to base to get repaired. So it's kind of a big deal. Let's see. So yeah, I mean, I guess if you want to put it that way, we were down to 2 carriers in the Pacific because the Yorktown was getting fixed. So things weren't looking super hot for the Americans either. This was the Doolittle Raid. Now, after the Battle of Coral Sea in April of 1942, this man named Jimmy Doolittle, that you see over here on your left, had a plan to take 16 U.S. Army bombers off from the deck of an aircraft carrier to bomb Tokyo. Jimmy Doolittle was like, if we bomb Tokyo, that would be a pretty cool, like, it would send a message to the Japanese and be like, yo, you guys aren't invincible. We can totally bomb you too. And was basically the main mission of the Doolittle Raid. Now, the Doolittle Raiders were bombing like small factories and munitions depots in the Tokyo city itself. But each airplane, because they had to make every airplane really, really lightweight, they weren't able to carry a lot of bombs. So the actual damage done by the Doolittle Raiders was not that much. But what was important was that the Japanese saw American bombers over their home islands, and they realized that they weren't invincible. So that was kind of the point of the Doolittle Raid. So it wasn't to do real tactical damage, it was more to send a message. So Jimmy Doolittle was a highly experienced Army Air Forces pilot, and he had 18 of these bombers that took off from the USS Hornet, and they hit Japanese targets in Tokyo. Yep, so talked about that. Now, so the American counterattacks, the Doolittle Raid, and the Battle of Coral Sea made the Japanese realize that they needed to actually take care of the American carriers. If they took out the American carriers, then they wouldn't have to deal with the American Navy for the rest of the war. Because at this point, the American Navy was kind of a thorn in the side of the Japanese. Even though they weren't doing any real damage, they still had to worry about the American carriers. And the Japanese thought, you know what, screw it. If the United States Navy could be completely taken out, then we would, be able to win. So they had to make a plan. They had to make a plan to sink all the American carriers in one go. All right. And so the Battle of Midway became the Japanese Navy's plan to lure the American carriers out and, take them out. And like basically, destroy the American carriers once and for all. So Midway Island was chosen to be the target, of the Japanese Navy, because the Japanese thought, okay, if we hit Midway, if we start attacking Midway, then if we make this our target, then the Americans will actually want to defend it and use their carriers to come and fight us. Right? So Midway was kind of like gonna be it, right? So the Battle of Midway was kind of chosen as a stage for the Japanese carriers to come out and sink the Americans once and for all. Yeah, so Chris is saying that the Battle of Midway was, the Japanese thought that the Americans didn't know about the Battle of Midway. Yeah, so American counterintelligence was actually on the case. The American, so here's the thing. The Japanese wanted to lure the Americans out into the fight, but the Japanese didn't know that the Americans knew exactly where they were coming from. So both sides knew that they were gonna fight at Midway, by 1942, by June of 1942. But what the Japanese didn't know was that the Americans were even more prepared than they thought they were. So this is the Kido Butai. All right, so there's 4 carriers. There's the Akagi, the Kaga, the Hiryu, and the Soryu. Right, so these are the same 4 carriers that, attacked Pearl Harbor. There were 2 battleships, 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 12 destroyers, and between these 4 carriers, there were 248 carrier-based aircraft. So there were a lot of airplanes that the Japanese were bringing to the fight. The Akagi was still the flagship of the Japanese Navy. All right, and it was the same flagship that launched the first strike against Pearl Harbor. So it was pretty famous at this point of the war. The American forces, on the other hand, so America was actually able to fix the USS Yorktown in time for the Battle of Midway. So the United States actually had 3 carriers. They had the Yorktown, the Hornet, and the Enterprise. There were 7 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 15 destroyers, 233 carrier-based aircraft, but 127 land-based aircraft from Midway Island itself. All right. So remember, it's not just like the carrier planes, but it's also the planes from Midway Island that were going to take off and help fight the war. So 36 level bombers and 36 dive bombers from Hiryu and Soryu hit Midway early in the morning on June 4th, 1942, and they hit installations on Eastern and Sand Island. All right, so the strike group commander of this group, his name was Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga. All right, so Tomonaga, he had all his planes attack the island, and then he realized that the runways weren't damaged enough, right? So the runways, if you want to take out an airport, you have to destroy the runways. And the runways weren't like damaged enough to the point that they were inoperable. So Tomonaga was like, okay, we're going to need a second wave of airplanes to hit Midway Island, right? So 72 airplanes were deployed by the Japanese to bomb the island. Okay, so keep that in mind. Okay, so 36 level bombers and 36 dive bombers. So Tomonaga was like, all right, that's not enough. We need more airplanes. We need another strike. Now, at the same time, at 0700 hours, Midway Island actually launches 15 B-17 bombers, 4 B-26s, 6 Avenger torpedo bombers, and 26 SPD dive bombers against the Japanese fleet. So Midway actually is sending a counterattack to hit the Japanese fleet. The Americans at Midway knew where the Japanese were. So they were actually able to start attacking the Japanese fleet, okay? Now, were they successful? Let's see. At the same time as, they're being attacked, whoops, let me clear this real quick. Clear all drawings. Tomonaga, at the same time as the Japanese are being attacked by the American bombers, Tomonaga reports that a second strike is necessary to neutralize Midway Island. Right, so Admiral Nagumo, who is the main strike group commander of the Japanese Kita Butai, he needs to decide if he wants to use his reserve aircraft to hit the island or to wait for Tomonaga's planes to come back, right, to come back land, rearm them, and then relaunch all the airplanes for a second strike, right? Because he wants to make sure that because like the reserve planes are kept, in reserve in case they see the American ships, so they can launch the reserve planes to hit the American ships while Tomonaga's strike force is attacking the island. So this is smart, right? You don't want to use all your planes on one target because otherwise you might leave yourself vulnerable. So 0700 to 0715. So these are the crucial moments. At 0715, Nagumo went against Yamamoto's orders. Let's see. And made the call to rearm his reserve aircraft with bombs instead of torpedoes. So Nagumo decided, okay, I'm going to actually have my reserve airplanes take bombs instead of torpedoes because I'm going to send my reserve airplanes out to bomb Midway Island. So he was going to actually follow Tomonaga's suggestion and start to bomb Midway Island, okay? So he rearmed his reserve planes with anti-ground munitions instead of like anti-ship munitions. All right. Now, at 7:45 a.m., a scouting airplane, a Japanese scouting plane, spots an American surface fleet, 240 miles northeast of Midway, and they're steering southwest into the wind. Okay, and that's actually the same exact heading that Nagumo's own ships are headed into. So he's thinking, oh snap! Like if these new ships that are being spotted are those the American carriers? He doesn't know though. He doesn't know if they're the American carriers because like what if they are? But it could be possible that those ships that just got spotted could just be battleships or cruisers, right? Now his reserve planes are already getting rearmed with land bombs instead of torpedoes. So even if he wanted to launch planes against that new American surface fleet, he can't because they're carrying the wrong weapons, right? Does that make sense, guys? So in order to attack a ship, you need to use torpedoes, right? But his reserve planes are already getting switched over from torpedoes to regular bombs because he had them switch their weapons because he thought that they were gonna get sent to bomb the island. So Nagumo right now is not in a good spot. He's spotted he spotted the American fleet. Okay, so the bombs that they got loaded up with are land bombs. So land bombs and anti-ship bombs are different, because when you're dropping like a bomb on a ship, typically you want to be like a dive bomber. So basically they're using their Kates, they're like torpedo bombers as regular bombers. Whereas like if you wanted to, because like ships move, right? So if you're doing some level bombing in a torpedo bomber, your bomb is dropping straight down, and you can't really aim your bombs accurately because the ship's moving. Kevin says dive bomber sink ships. Yeah, exactly. So if you're using a dive bomber, it doesn't really matter that much. A dive bomber can use the same bomb on a plane, or sorry, on a ship as on a ground unit, right? But a level bomber, on the other hand, has to use a torpedo instead of like a regular bomb. So there you go. At 0745, this is Nagumo's famous dilemma. So at 0745, Nagumo has to decide, should I recover my aircraft from Tomonaga's force on the morning attack on Midway Island and launch against the American carriers at full strength, or should I strike with half of my total strength while I have the element of surprise? Okay, so he's asking himself, should he wait for his planes to first come back and then launch at full strength, or should he only or should he strike now, basically?
Well, so it's basically like you have a critical hit at 0.5%, and you don't have a critical hit at full percent. So yeah, that would be pretty hard.
It's a hard choice to make, right?
Yeah.
And let's make this even harder. Let's make this even harder. All right, guys. When you signed up for my class, did you guys realize that you guys were going to become experts in Japanese naval doctrine from World War II? Yeah, I didn't think so. So by the time we finish with this presentation, you guys are going to know way more about Japanese aircraft carriers than you ever wanted to know in your entire lives. So here we go. So the Japanese aircraft carriers were really, really weird in that they had a unique doctrine. Okay, so regarding flight deck operations, they had a special standard operating procedure, S.O.P. When under attack, a Japanese carrier had to defend itself. So the way that a Japanese aircraft carrier could defend itself was with combat air patrols. That's what the fighters are protecting the fleet. It could use anti-aircraft fire, or it could take evasive maneuvers. So when a ship is taking evasive maneuvers, you can see in these pictures that it's going to be constantly moving at full speed to make it harder to sink for like a torpedo or something, right? Now, if a ship is taking evasive maneuvers, it's hard to actually launch airplanes off the flight deck because you have to launch planes into the wind, like on a carrier, okay? Also, during an attack, Japanese carriers would keep their flight decks clear so their combat air patrol fighters could land and refuel and get more ammo and take off again, right? Because it was important for the combat air patrol fighters to be able to be constantly protecting the ships. So this is something to think about, okay? So if you look at these pictures, you can see these Japanese carriers, taking evasive maneuvers, and these were actually pictures taken during the Battle of Midway. Basically, Japanese naval commanders would never ever launch a big airstrike while under attack. Okay, so as long as the carriers are under attack, Japanese captains could not launch an airstrike. They could recover and launch combat air patrol fighters that were already going out and shooting down all the incoming bombers, but they couldn't launch a big airstrike all at once. That was just impossible, was not going within their doctrine. Now it's complicated even more. So at 8:15, Tomonaga's force was going to be coming back to the carriers, and they need to actually let Tomonaga's strike group land. Okay, if Tomonaga's strike group can't land, they're all going to have to ditch their planes into the ocean, and that would not be good because you would just lose a lot of airplanes that way. However, Japanese carriers can only do one thing at a time. They can launch airplanes, recover airplanes, or spot aircraft onto the flight deck. So by spotting a plane onto the flight deck, what that means is you're bringing all the planes from the hangars up to the flight deck and then launching them to like prepare to launch them. But they can only do one of these things at a time. So Nagumo needed to think, do I launch the counterattack now? If I do, then he needs to finish launching his planes by 8:45, okay? Because Tomonaga's planes are coming at 8:15. But they have enough fuel to last until 8:45. At 8:45, if Nagumo's not done launching his plane, Tomonaga's planes are going to run out of fuel. So the current time is 7:45. Nagumo needs 45 minutes to launch his aircraft. So they would really need to finish launching by 8:45 because that's as late as they can go, right? And Tomonaga will only have enough fuel to circle the fleet until 9:15, until they have to start ditching. So this is not a very good place to be. So should he send his reserve aircraft? After that American surface fleet, using any of the ordnance available, even if it was the wrong ordnance, right? Or should he wait for Tomonaga's planes to come back from their first strike and then launch all their planes together? All right. So this becomes the question. What would you guys do? All right. So here we're going to have a little discussion. All right. So let's see. I'm going to call on someone I haven't called on yet. Let's go with Alina. Alina, what would you do if you were Admiral Nagumo?
I would wait for the Tomonaga guy to come back with his fleet because I feel like then you're stronger and you can like attack more.
Okay, so Alina says that she would wait for Tomonaga's first strike group to come back and then launch all the planes together. See, a couple of you guys have your hands up. I'm going to go ahead and call on someone else I haven't heard from yet before I get to you guys. I'm going to call on Angela.
I wouldn't be there in the first place.
You wouldn't be there in the first place, but if you were, though, if you were Admiral Nagumo, if you wait, would you wait for Tomonaga's planes to come back, or would you?
I feel like if we're being realistic, I would waste a lot of time being indecisive because I'm very indecisive, and then choose a random choice. I think wait.
You would wait? Okay. Let's see. Alex, what would you do?
I would attack now because if we don't, they will have a really high percent chance of being destroyed.
Why do you say that they will have a high chance of being destroyed?
Because if they don't launch now, they will not be. The other aircraft would. They will not. If they launch their aircraft now, they will be better than not because there are already other U.S. aircrafts attacking them.
Okay.
And bombing.
Yes. Yeah. So.
And if they and you already and when the what was the other guy's name called?
Tomonaga.
Tomonaga runs out of fuel. Tomonaga needs to have fuel, and when they are refueling, they cannot attack. So it's a lose-lose situation there.
So Alex is saying like he would actually launch now because
there won't be another chance.
Yeah, because he doesn't think that they're going to have another chance to actually get this opportunity. That's really good. Let's see. Brian's had his hand up for a while. Hang on. Is this Brian? No, this is Chris. Chris has had his hand up for a while. Chris.
I would attack first because if I wait for Tomonaga's plane to return, they need time to land and refuel, and then they will take up space on the deck. So there will be no space for the other dive bombers to attack.
Yeah, so he would wait for...
And then if they take too long, the U.S. aircraft carriers would come and then start attacking, and then they wouldn't be able to launch.
Very good, because so I like how Chris is taking into account that Japanese carriers cannot launch strikes while under attack. Very good thing to point out. Jerry, how about you?
I think like surprise is a key. Any attack is better than no attack and waiting, because while the Japanese are coming back and Tominaga is coming back and refueling, the Americans also get like reinforcements probably.
Exactly.
And so if you launch an attack with improper equipment, if you hit them, at least to hit them, but if you wait there, you're not going to do anything.
Very good. So Jerry's saying that he would wait. He'd rather launch with the wrong equipment than not launch at all. Because if you launch with the wrong equipment, you still have a chance of hitting them. If you wait, then you're throwing away your chance of hitting anyone, even if you're using the wrong equipment. I like that. Let's see. Chloe, I haven't heard you talk yet.
I think I would launch too, because if you launch right now, then you still have like a % of hitting them, even if it's like less. But if you like wait, then it gives time for the Americans to also prepare more, and you might miss it.
Yeah. So Chloe is saying that she would also launch her planes now rather than later. So a lot of you guys are making good points, and like I like how a lot of you guys are pointing out that the main reason you would want to launch now is because the opportunity, right? Like having the chance to actually strike the Americans, even if you have the wrong equipment, is still better than not launching at all. So that's a very good point that you guys are bringing up, because it's absolutely true. Like even if your planes are loaded with the wrong equipment, at least you have a better chance of hitting them, before that chance slips away. But that's not what really happened. Nagamo decided to wait. So Nagamo decided to wait for Tomonaga's planes to return, and then start to prepare his planes to be spotted onto the flight deck. However, at this point, torpedo bombers from the VT-6 and VT-8, so that's from the Hornet and the Enterprise, started to attack the Kita Butai. So not only did Nagamo decide to wait at that crucial moment, the American torpedo bombers also started to come to attack the Japanese ships. Okay, so this was not a very good position to be. The torpedo bombers were attacking the ships, but the Kita Butai started to take evasive action, right? So all the ships were now taking evasive action, so their launch window got pushed back even longer. All right, and then these torpedo bombers, they don't actually score any hits. As a matter of fact, they all get slaughtered. Okay, only one crew of all of these bombers makes it back alive. And that's
what?
Like, yeah.
Only one? That's
only
insane.
one crew. Yeah.
The people must have really
what
destroyed them then.
Yeah, so
that's pretty normal. It's pretty normal in war.
These torpedo bombers were actually the TBD Devastators, the really useless ones that were obsolete that I told you guys earlier about. And they got cut to ribbons by the Japanese Zeros. So when a torpedo bomber is attacking a ship, it has to come in really low and really slow, close to the surface of the water, right? So these Japanese fighters that see these torpedo bombers coming in, they'll just go down and clobber up all these torpedo bombers. So they're really vulnerable during the attack run, and it was really not very good for
Jordan.
Sorry. Yeah.
But were most of the torpedo bombers escorted by fighter planes?
Nope. So this was really sad too, because on their way to the Japanese ships, the American torpedo bombers were not able to meet up with their escort. So they were supposed to have an escort of fighter planes, and they were supposed to rendezvous in midair, but they never made it. So the torpedo bombers went on by themselves. It was actually a really brave move by the Hornet and the Enterprise's pilots, but unfortunately, it didn't work out for them. But by the time Nagamo realized that the torpedo bombers that were attacking his ships came from American carriers, it was too late. It was 10 o'clock at this point. The torpedo bombers actually pushed his launch window back 45 whole entire minutes. And, all the Japanese fighters now were at low altitude, right? So they were all chasing these torpedo bombers at low altitude right over the surface of the water. And they weren't paying attention to anything that was high up in the air. And that was precisely when the dive bombers from the USS Enterprise found the Japanese fleet. And at 10:22 in the morning, the dive bomber struck. All right. Let's see. Jerry, you have your hand up?
It'd just be really easy to shoot down the bomb. No, the Japanese planes at this point in time.
Yeah, so
Jordan.
This picture shows American dive bombers at the Battle of Midway, right? So these are
Jordan.
actually the American SPD Dauntlesses. And when they happened upon the Japanese fleet was not in a good position. And within 5 minutes, they sank like all 4 of the Japanese carriers. Right?
Teacher Jordan, but did the Japanese fleet have destroyers and cruisers with anti-aircraft weapons to
very good point. So Alex brings up that
because I think there were 14 destroyers and 8 cruisers.
Yeah, so the Japanese had a lot of ships, right? And he brings up anti-aircraft guns. That's a really good point. Okay, so this is actually going to be a really fun, really interesting bit of history for you guys. And it's kind of random, so bear with me here. But when you're shooting down an airplane with a gun, right? Let's demonstrate. So if I'm shooting down an airplane with a gun, right? When your bullets aren't going to be able to destroy the airplane, just by themselves, right? Like a little bullet like this, can't hurt an airplane. And an anti-aircraft gun is no different, right? So Japanese anti-aircraft guns, and actually every anti-aircraft gun, when you make shells and guns that are meant to shoot down airplanes, you have to have a special kind of bullet, and those bullets are called have something called proximity fuses, right? So these shells will explode as long as the bullet can detect that it's close to something, that's close in proximity to something.
Oh, so basically, it's like there's an object, it goes down.
No, it's the way that an anti-aircraft shell works is the proximity fuse will detect either through a light sensor or through a magnet that it's passing close to something, and when it passes close to something, it'll explode.
And basically, they'll sense metal.
So that way, they don't have to actually score a direct hit on an airplane to shoot it down, right? So yeah, it can detect metal, or it can detect light, like if it passes a shadow or something. So the Americans had proximity fuses because we were able to figure them out. The Germans also had proximity fuses, but Japan never quite figured out how to make proximity fuses, and none of their anti-aircraft shells had them. So Japanese anti-aircraft guns and anti-aircraft gunners actually had to score a direct hit in order to shoot down an airplane. Okay, and that's not easy. That means that the gunner has to actually be able to shoot a moving airplane to actually take it down. Julian, this class will end at we'll end by 5. Okay. So even though all these ships that were with the carriers had anti-aircraft guns on them, they weren't very effective. So if you look at this picture of the American dive bombers, you can actually tell that there's not a lot of anti-aircraft shells, being fired up at them. If you look at those pictures earlier of these, let me pull up the picture of, so if you look at these pictures of the Japanese carriers taking evasive action, you also don't see anti-aircraft puffs, right? So the Japanese were not actually able to put up anti-aircraft fire as much. Their main way of defending against air attack was combat air patrols from their fighters. And Nagamo was convinced that his combat air patrols would be good enough to defend his carriers from the Americans, but he was wrong. So because Nagamo decided to wait, right? Because he decided to wait instead of actually sending off planes, when he had the chance, he lost his opportunity. Nagamo lost his opportunity to actually strike at the Americans during the Battle of Midway. So the Battle of Midway, the Japanese, their main attack was basically just on the American islands. All right. Later on, after they lost the Kaga and the Akagi, the Hiryu did launch a counterattack, but the Hiryu hit the Yorktown, right? And they weren't able to sink the Yorktown. And even worse for the Japanese, the sailors on board that American carrier were able to fix it up and get it back underway so quickly and so efficiently that the second wave of airplanes from the Hiryu attacked the Yorktown again, thinking it was the USS Saratoga. So the Japanese actually accidentally hit the same carrier twice at the Battle of Midway during their eventual counterattack, and they weren't able to even sink it. So this was a disaster for the Japanese Navy. They lost their biggest fleet carriers. The power balance was now back to the United States, right? They made a lot of miscalculations at this point. Like by the end of the Battle of Midway, things were not looking good for Japan. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share right now for a little bit. And I'm going to go ahead and pull up another slide for you guys. All right, so what do you guys think of the Battle of Midway? Like, I'm sure you guys are like kind of familiar with the story in some regard, like it happened, right? But how do you guys feel about it now? Like, do you like definitely feel like you know a little bit more than you knew about it before?
I knew nothing at the Battle of Midway before this.
Oh, really?
And I have to say, that guy was stupid. He was really stupid. He was so stupid. I don't even want to talk about it.
You don't want to talk about Admiral Nagano?
He has the most. How in the hell was he? Just take the opportunity. Just it's right there. You could just launch your planes, and you did it.
Who else?
Excuse me for a second.
And I'm gonna go with. Trying to think of one last question to ask you guys. This one might be fun. Okay, yeah. All right. So I'm go ahead and share my screen again for you guys. And we are going to do a little quiz. It's just going to be a couple minutes long. I want you guys to answer these 3 questions, okay? And I guess like part number, like if you want bonus points or if you want like a special extension of question number 1, you can also tell me how many American carriers were in the Pacific in January 1942, okay? So which American carrier was sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea? So don't write your answers yet. You can type them out, but I'm going to call on you guys and ask you guys to answer these, okay? So don't answer these yet. Kevin, or you can direct message them to me privately. Yeah, in the chat. That's a good idea. Just to see if you guys are all paying attention. It's funny because like when you guys are talking about cheese, I've actually been eating. I've got some cheese here. It's a smoked Gouda from Whole Foods. I like cheese. Do you guys like cheese? I hope you like cheese. I want this block of cheese too, but I plan to eat it with some crackers later. Big cheese. Oh, Eddie doesn't like cheese. Sad. Sorry, Eddie. No, nobody's perfect. I'm just kidding, Eddie. What if you're lactose intolerant? I don't know. I guess I'm not lactose intolerant, but I guess if you're lactose intolerant, you can't really enjoy cheese.
Jordan, teacher Jordan.
Yeah, what's up, dude?
Cheese.
Nice.
Yeah, I love cheese sticks. They're my favorite type of cheese.
No, smoked Gouda's pretty good. I'm gonna give you guys. Let's go like 2 more minutes. Man, I love cheese. I'll show you guys something cool. 1 second. I have this book called Never Call Me a Hero. This is written by a dive bomber pilot named Norman Jack Dusty Kleiss. Okay, so Norman Kleiss. And he was a dive bomber pilot from the USS Enterprise during the Battle of Midway. And interestingly enough, this was his personal revolver that he carried in his airplane. And I have it. It was kind of neat. So this is Dusty Kleiss's revolver. This revolver was at the Battle of Midway, and I think that's kind of cool that now it chills on my desk next to my copy of Pokemon Shield. So we're chilling. Kevin, yes, and yes. It's okay. All right. So most of you guys, all the answers that you guys are submitting are pretty good, mostly correct. I'm pretty happy with you guys. So number 1, how many Japanese carriers were in the Pacific in January 1942? All right. So the answer to number 1, who wants to answer number 1 for everybody? Madison, I'm going to call on you.
I think it was 2, because that's basically what I remember.
Yeah, so there were actually, Alina, I'm going to call on Alina. How many carriers were there, Alina, in the Pacific? 6. There were 6 Japanese carriers in the Pacific. Yeah. There were 2 Japanese carriers at the Battle of Coral Sea, though, Madison, so you were right about that one. But there were actually 6 Japanese carriers in the Pacific. Now, who wants to tell us how many American carriers were in the Pacific? In January 1942. I'm gonna look through the gallery to find someone I haven't called on yet. Julian, how many American carriers were in the Pacific? January 42. Can you hear me, Julian? How about you, Chris?
4?
4. There were 4 carriers in the Pacific in January 42. All right. Number 2. Which American carrier got sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea? Which American carrier got sunk at the Battle of Coral Sea? Madison.
It's the USS Lexington.
Lexington. We lost the Lady Lex. That's what we called her. All right. The last one is probably the trickiest one out of all these. A Japanese carrier could do 3 things on its flight deck, right? It could do 3 flight deck operations. Which 3 were they, and how many of them could they do at one time? Roger, I'm going to call on you.
I'm not sure.
Okay, that's okay. How about you, AJ?
Sorry, not sure.
Okay. Chloe, how about you?
I'm pretty sure it was you could do like one at a time, and there was like launching.
That's one.
I think I forgot the rest of them.
Launching, and what else? To help her out. Someone help her out. Madison, you want to help her out?
No, not now.
Okay. Madison, how about you, Kevin? You want to help us out? So you can launch airplanes. What else can you do?
I sent it in the chat.
Kevin said it in the chat. Okay, what did he say? Launching, loading recovering airplanes. Yeah, so you can launch airplanes. You can recover aircraft. What's the last thing that a Japanese carrier can do? Alex.
I think it was making way for aircraft to land.
That's called spotting aircraft, right? So spotting aircraft is when you put airplanes onto the flight deck from the hangar deck. So out of these three things, it can only do one at a time, right? So yeah, very good. I'm going to go ahead and let's screen share. I'm going to stop my screen share. I'm going to show you guys with the one last PowerPoint. So yeah, so that's kind of typically, how a history, I guess, class would go, for our program. Now, I generally will assign some homework, but for today, we don't have any of that because this is just a like a trial lesson, right? A trial, an open house lesson, so to speak. But I'm going to go ahead and share this screen. So typically during our actual classes, I will assign homework. So there's going to be reading. There'll be some activities and writing to do because, like I was saying, we've got some focus on public speaking. I want to make sure that everyone actually will take turns presenting something that they read or something that they learned to the class. All right. We'll have a recap for what we did on our last class. And our reading assignment, we'll have I'll assign you as a reading assignment, and then we'll do some reflection and post discussion, like talking about what we did and what we learned and what we liked and didn't like. So it's going to be that. The primary source analysis is also going to be a thing for every class. So that S.O.A.P.STONE that we did earlier is going to be a lot more of that. And you guys are actually really good at that. I'm really impressed that you guys were able to really analyze that document so well. So that was really good. So here are some different subjects that we're going to be offering, right? So our first one is the Great American Innovators. That's 101. We're talking about Ben Franklin, Thomas Edison, Washington Carver, Elon Musk, how Americans and our technological innovation kind of shaped what America represents now. World War for 102, that one might be something that a lot of you guys are interested in. That's going to talk about the American involvement in different wars, from the Revolutionary War to the Global War on Terror, right? And how wars change America's presence in the world, and how innovations in weaponry changes how we fight, right? So that one, I'll actually show a lot more of my collection. I collected military equipment and firearms and historical firearms and stuff like that. So if you guys want to see cool stuff, that's the one that I'll show you guys a lot of cool stuff in. 103 is the Great American Entrepreneurs. We'll be talking about the Andrew Carnegie, Rockefeller, Henry Ford, Walt Disney, a lot of the entrepreneurs that really changed, all these success stories that we hear about all the time and how they kind of built their empires. 104 is really fun. So 104 talks about the Chinese American identity. So we're talking about Chinese Americans in American history, starting from our roots in the gold rush, building the Intercontinental Railroad, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1894. So we're actually, dude, Chinese people are the only ethnic group of people ever excluded from entering America. Do you guys believe that? It's pretty crazy. You hear about all these things with different, ethnic groups that are banned from America, but Chinese people
no.
are the only.
Actually, I heard of that before. Because
Yeah.
I'm Chinese. I'm Chinese. Cool. I'm from China.
Yeah.
So I know. about
Yeah, so in 1894, you know, Chinese people were actually like, we were all like banned from coming into the country. It's pretty crazy. And like how we kind of became what's called the model minority to America now. 105, we're talking about the roots, the inspiration for what kind of became America, talking about the Greek system and how we adopted it, right? And like how the people, you know, how our founding fathers basically founded America back in the 1700s. And lastly, 106 is the shining city on a hill, kind of talking about how after World War II, after World War I, America's presence kind of changed in the world, and we became a lot more of a dominant player in global affairs, and how that actually happened. So here's all these, like, these are primarily right now, all these subjects are more like American history centric. And like for you guys, since you guys are older than everyone else, I will actually assign you guys more reading. But also you, like, depending on, because like I want to make this fun for you guys too. If you guys prefer writing assignments, then we'll do some writing assignments. If you guys prefer reading assignments, we'll do some reading. So like I do want to talk with you guys, if you like, you know, once we get the classes started as students, like what you guys would like, and we can kind of shift things around, because I want to make sure that I'm talking about things that you're interested in too. So we'll kind of bounce ideas off of each other and like make things work for like what helps you, right? Because I know like some people really get a lot from out of like a reading assignment. Some people kind of get more from a writing assignment. So that's gonna work. All right. Well, thank you guys for joining.